Hi, Misha here, and in the past I've covered American attack aircraft like the A-4 and A-7. I've also covered bombers like the B-17 and the B-25. And at some point the line between bombers and attack planes started to get blurred. And this plane here is really where it happened. This is the Douglas A-20 Havoc, known in Britain as the Boston, and this is specifically the A-20G variant, the most widely produced version, and the version more or less specialized as a attack gunship. Used by the U.S. Air Forces under the Army, and later for a brief time the U.S. Air Force as an independent branch, also used extensively by the British and Soviet Union, and even quite a bit of use with the French, Free French, and Liberated French, amongst many others. It's a very interesting history behind this plane. It dates back to 1936, 1937, when Donald Douglas, Jack Northrop, and Ed Heinemann kind of came together and came up with the design for a new light, medium altitude bomber. And this was it kind of gelled in early 1937, and the idea was for a 2-engine bomber with a range of about 1,200 miles, a bomb capacity of about 1,000 pounds, and, something capable of about 350 miles per hour. So very fast for that day and time, although a light bomb load. Not as light as it seems to us today, but still even kind of light for then. But, it had its potential purpose. However, more research, more mathematics kind of revealed that the plans really wouldn't work out. The plane would be underpowered, could never achieve speed and do everything they wanted it to do. So it was kind of shelved for a bit. Well, later that year, the U.S. Army Air Corps announced that it needed a new attack plane, attack bomber, and set out specs. And so Heinemann kind of dusted off what was known before as the Model 7, reworked it with better, more modern engines, and submitted it to the trial. And this would happen throughout 1938. It would actually go up against the North American NA-40, which I've already covered in the B-25 video. It would go up against a design from Martin, which ultimately would kind of materialize into the B-26 Marauder, and a fourth design from Stearman that I don't know if it really materialized into much of anything. The Army Air Corps wasn't just really into this whole project. A lot of it was being driven by foreign interest from the UK and especially France in 1938. They were the ones on the front line of Hitler being Hitler. And so the French actually kind of surreptitiously took part in the trials, giving suggestions, watching. America at the time was very isolationist. They weren't real keen on it, but the White House was tacitly behind it, so the French were kind of backseat drivers. So they kind of drove the selection board, and they liked the Heinemann design, which became the Douglas DB-7. So it got selected. And basically, in early 1939, the Roosevelt White House ordered cooperation with the French in allowing the French to order initially 100 of the DB-7 attack bombers. And then, of course, war began in September when Germany invaded Poland, along with the Soviet Union, I must add. And so France would quickly up their order to 250. And deliveries would commence early the next year after some tinkering and testing and revising. Unfortunately, by May 10 of the following year, Germany would invade France herself. Once again, going through Belgium. Poor Belgium. Only about 64 of the original 250 DB-7s had been delivered, and they were used in the initial invasion and defense against the Germans. But as we all know, it didn't, opposition could not last long, and the French government fell, many of its members escaping to Britain, forming the Free French, and the DB-7s were flown to North Africa so they wouldn't get destroyed or impounded by the Germans. Well, the Vichy government would basically be a puppet government set up by the Germans because, in any nation of millions of people, you can find collaborators. And they kind of had the populace by the short hairs anyway. And so the Vichy government would take control of the planes in North Africa. Well, since France was no longer viable, the UK, which was also interested in the plane, would end up taking delivery of the undelivered French DB-7s, also known as the DB-7A, and they would name it the Boston. At the same time, Douglas was working. You can see how I can most make that slip up. McDonnell this time was a totally different company. Anyway, they would actually work on a more of a medium bomber for Britain. The French DB-7 was more of an attack plane. Think of it as almost like a heavy fighter. And Britain wanted more of a bomber with better range and payload. So that would end up being the DB-7B and end up being the Boston 2. Well, the British would receive their first planes in early 41, and by early 42 they would have them in service. They weren't really well suited, at least the DB-7As, to bombers because they lacked the range. So they would employ them as okay effective night fighters. They would install spotlights, they would install extra machine guns, yada yada. Later these would be supplanted by newer models which could actually equip radar, meaning its night fighter days were relatively numbered. It's worth pointing out that when issued as a night fighter, they would call this the Havoc in Britain, and the day fighter version would be the Boston. And they would use them as a light bomber. In the summer of that year, 42, elements of the American Air Corps would start operating with the RAF as kind of a combined force, and in July they would start attacking German-occupied airfields in the Netherlands using this plane, the Boston, or the A-20 Havoc, as it was known in the Air Corps. As I mentioned in the other bomber videos, what the Air Corps was doing in 1939-1940 they were giving priority to foreign orders because, of course, until Pearl Harbor, America wasn't directly in the war and was trying to be more or less neutral, even though, well, Lend-Lease and, of course, all that. They learned lessons from French use and then later British use of this plane, and Douglas would make an upgraded version, which the Army Air Corps would adopt, is the A-20C. And so they would have an initial order of 143 delivered in 1941. And as time would go on, of course, more and more would go to the Army Air Corps. Now, interestingly, a lot of the ones that the Army Air Corps would receive or were earmarked for them would also be sent instead to Russia via Alaska. And Russia was maybe perhaps the biggest, or at least this is a very influential plane in the USSR. Obviously, after Operation Barbarossa in June of 41, Russia was in a bad way. It had to relocate a lot of its factories. A lot of material, a lot of planes were lost. And so this came at a very good time in 1942, and there would be more A-20s in Russian service than any other foreign bomber. In fact, nearly 3,500 would be sent to Russia, most used by the Air Force, but a few by their Navy. And that's a big number when you consider that fewer than 7,500 Havocs were made. So, nearly half of production. Originally, Russians would use the plane to attack German tanks, German troops. It is a very low-altitude, pure attack craft, not really as a bomber at all. These missions were extremely costly for both the Germans and the Soviets. A lot of people died on both ends. The initial C version, and it's hard to say exactly specs on these because they changed a lot and reconfigured. Originally they would be fitted with just 4 30 caliber machine guns in the nose. Then they would play around for a year or so with a 75mm cannon, which never really went into production. Then they would go to the early G model, which this is here, which at first have 4 50 caliber machine guns in the nose and 2, I mixed that up, I do apologize. It would have 2 50 caliber machine guns and 4 20mm cannon. And so the Soviet Union would start to receive these in quite large numbers. The G model would go into production in February of 43. Obviously, having 4 cannon and 2 machine guns was quite devastating. However, the cannon weren't as accurate or reliable as anyone would wish, and they were slower firing. So later planes would be fitted with 6 50 caliber Browning Modus machine guns, and the Russians would receive many of these as well. Even then, Russians not completely satisfied with the rate of fire, they would replace them with even faster firing machine guns. And I will say that yes, earlier Havocs would have 30 caliber machine guns, but most of these would get replaced out by 50 calibers. They would also start adding a turret on top. At first it would be a manual, later they would go to an electrically powered one, and they would have a single gun on the bottom, and it would be 30 caliber, and then later on replaced by a 50 cal. This also would sometimes be left off for other munitions or just fuel tanks, so that it seems like the bottom gun wasn't always there. So the G version like this here is just shy of 48 feet long. It has a wingspan of 61 feet. It has 2 engines, as you see, although it could fly on one in an emergency. It had a crew of 3, 1 pilot and a gunner. Some versions would have a bombardier if they were the medium altitude light bomber, but this would not. Also, some earlier versions could have a crew of 4, but most of them seem to be 3. Sources are a little unclear. I haven't dug too deep. Some sources claim the early versions all had a crew of 4, including the ones going to France. The thing is, the French designated this as the DB-7B3, 3 for a 3-man crew, so no. But most versions had 3 people. This heavily armed attack version could get up to about 317 miles per hour. Earlier, lighter loaded versions could get up to 325 and even 330 miles per hour. But this one here has more armor, more guns, self-sealing fuel tanks, so it had more weight, more drag. So it was a little slower, but not bad. It also had a slightly lower ceiling. It couldn't quite make it to 24,000 feet, whereas older versions get up to at least 25,000. But again, this was a lower altitude plane, so no big deal. This particular model here is from Hobbymaster. It is a 1/72 scale diecast. Yeah, no, it's not a Corgi, right? And it is emblematic of a Havoc used in 1944 in New Guinea. And that brings us really to the Pacific. This was a very popular plane out there. Started to appear in reasonable numbers in 42, 43. And it was used for low altitude strafing and kind of skip bombing against Japanese high value targets, kind of pinpoint aiming, because if they came in low, they didn't really need a bombardier, they could just kind of eyeball it. Or I should say they didn't need a bomb site. They would use this against Japanese troops, railways, fuel dumps. They really went after aircraft on the ground, hangars, so on and so forth. And it was very successful because Japanese didn't have the best flak capability. And so they didn't have to worry about that. And quite early on in the war, America would end up with air superiority there. And this did really perform kind of like a heavy fighter. We have lots of guns, we have a turret. It could operate with one engine, as I said. It could take a lot of abuse. Pilots, both American, British, French, and Russian, all loved it. It was kind of considered an overpowered, overbuilt plane. It was considered very maneuverable, very forgiving. It had a tricycle landing gear, which was easy to, land with, which is kind of what you do with landing gear. And this was pretty well liked by pilots, and it was very effective for what it was. I mean, obviously it had shortcomings. For example, it didn't have the best range, about 900 miles, and its bomb load in the light bomber was about 4,000 pounds, but in the attack version like this, it was reduced to 2,000 pounds. So not a lot of bombs on board. It could also carry some external rockets or even a torpedo. So that was a thing. Or it could just have the bomb bay filled with a fuel tank, which was very useful in the Pacific for those long missions between islands or whatnot. So that did limit it a little bit in the Pacific, but because of its durability and ability to really get in there and tangle with Japanese troops, it also was used to some extent to support ground troops, and therefore was very popular out in the Pacific. It was pretty devastating against the Japanese and was continually used until nearly the end of the war, definitely into 1945. Later on, it would start to get replaced late in the war out there, but, it saw pretty good use into 1945 in the Pacific. Zooming back to Europe, remember those DB-7s that the Vichy government got their hands on in North Africa? Well, in 1942, when the Allies launched in Operation Torch, the kind of invasion, reconquering of North Africa, the Vichy sent their acquired planes against the Allies. And the French, flying them almost entirely, switched over to the Allies either immediately or very quickly because, So many were used a few times against the Allies and then surrendered back to them. And they would be kind of recommitted as trainers and reconnaissance airplanes in the North African theater. But in December of that year, Army Air Corps, U.S. Army Air Corps Havocs would be stationed there and used to great effect to support troops on the ground as they, marched on through El Alamein and, of course, pushing Rommel out of the theater. They were also used during the invasion of Italy, again, kind of like in the Pacific, where they were striking key targets like transport hubs, troop columns, tanks, yada yada yada. And of course supporting the troops on the ground, so I bet one of these was a very welcome sight in the skies, kind of like an A-10 would be decades later. They were mostly used as a low-flying support craft in North Africa and Italy, but when they tried this in 1943 in Europe itself, German flak and fighters tore these up. So they very quickly suspended low-altitude light bombing with the Havoc. Instead, they tried using them as medium-altitude bombers, and they weren't really great suited for that. But after the D-Day, throughout the second half of 1944, again, these were used to support troops marching from France through the Low Countries and into Germany, again, assaulting columns, knocking out tanks, so on and so forth. And they would continue this role, but they would quickly be replaced by another plane from Douglas, another one over here that we'll get to in the next video, the A-26B Invader, later known as the B-26, quite confusingly. So the Havoc's tenure in Europe would be cut short in 1944, and most would be replaced for the last half year of the war there. But of course, Russia would continue to fly these, and they would do lots of modifications and so on and so forth. Production would end in 1944 with, as I said, a little under 7,500 produced. Most would be turned out by Douglas, but Boeing would actually produce a few up in Seattle as well, I think 300 or 400. It was a very popular plane, very adaptable. It wasn't what it wasn't, and it was what it was. And it was kind of the first plane of its class that blurred that line between bomber and big, heavy fighter. And, yeah. The Douglas A-20 Havoc. Not as well known today, overshadowed by much more popular planes, but back in World War II it was well known and respected. The Hobby Master model, the other models we did of bombers were from Corgi. This model is quite nice. It has, the typical Hobby Master features of opening canopy with the pilot figure. It only came with one pilot figure. I guess they just assumed the other crew are in the fuselage there. The turret does turn. The propellers, of course, turn. The landing gear do come down. I don't believe the bomb bay opens on this variant, so I'm assuming they were kind of going with more of a fuel tank instead there. We do have the gun nose. And yeah, that's pretty much it. The U.S. Air Force, when it was formed in 1947, would inherit the A-20. It would officially retire these in 1949. And that was more or less the end of its military tenure, because by that point it was considered, quote, an obsolete, quote, aircraft. But for when it flew, it was a cost-effective, lightweight attack craft. They could also double as a night fighter or a bomber. Oh, that's one thing I forgot to mention. They did try outfitting these in America as a night fighter in the Pacific as the P-70. They weren't very effective at all. They were very quickly replaced by the Northrop P-61 Black Widow, which was much more effective because it was a purpose-built night fighter. But a neat plane, and this model hasn't been in production for a bit from Hobbymaster. It's actually one of their earlier ones. You can kind of tell by a little bit of the way it's made, but that's not to say it's a bad plane. Pretty cool, and no one else does a Havoc that I'm aware of, except for like the resin or the wood models. Alrighty guys, so I hope if you knew about the Havoc, this wasn't a too disappointing video. And if you didn't know about the Havoc, I hope this was an educational one. If you could, like, share, and subscribe. Also check out some of my other videos. Or if you like big guns, check out the main Mishaco channel. Well, this is Misha, and I will catch you very soon when we get in to this plane here. I'll catch you then.